The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is your host, Paul Wirkus, this month with Dr. Anna Ermarth from Pediatric Gastroenterology at Primary Children's and the University of Utah. Welcome back, Anna.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.
So this is the week that is going to be really easy because we're going to talk about the treatment of celiac disease, and it's obvious and easy to do, right?
It's obvious and easy for the prescriber or practitioner. It's less easy for the family. I do say, and maybe this is some of my mentors' influence, it is a set it and forget it from a diagnostic standpoint. Once you diagnose it, you say gluten-free and go with some caveats. But yes, it's harder for the families actually doing it because it takes a little work.
Right. Before we start, do you have any disclosures that you'd like to share with us?
Not this week.
We had 3 responses to our disclosures at vcurb.com, but they all seem to have come from bots. So I'll pass them along, but you can do with them what you want.
AI will create me one, I know.
Yes, it will. All right. So as you said, treatment of pediatric celiac disease is simple, avoid gluten. Is there anything else before we finish our episode today?
I don't think so. I mean, let's move on to the last one, right? Or the question and answer.
So what does a gluten-free diet entail?
So we all know wheat, but did you know that barley and rye and malt and brewer's yeast and udon noodles and matzo and panko and bran and couscous are all parts of gluten or have gluten in them? And so that's where the confusion really comes in. You know, the actual things made with wheat are pretty easy to identify, but then you got to remember the products that we call by different names. I mean, I myself can remember asking my mom, what is couscous? Like, this doesn't make sense to me. It's pasta. It's just put down in a little different shape and form. So that for families, I think, is where the confusion starts to set in. And so having a dedicated process and education factor to a patient who's recently diagnosed with celiac disease is really important.
And being diagnosed with the disease or having a child diagnosed with the disease doesn't necessarily confer on you the ability to read labels very much. And I think labels have gotten easier to read, but you really have to read labels in detail.
Yeah. And I find, I'm very lucky. I don't have celiac disease. I have a stomach that I don't even think has IBS half the time. And so when I go to the store, I don't usually think twice about what to take off the shelves. But now these families have to think about everything they take off the shelves. Again, soy sauce has gluten in it. Barbecue sauce has gluten in it. The lucky part for families now is that there are very good dedicated apps. There are very good dedicated online things that will tell you what has gluten and what doesn't, and what's considered safe for celiac. And now you could just use your barcode and upload that through your camera on the phone, and it'll immediately give you the ingredient list or whether it's safe or not safe. I do want to plug celiac.org. That's the website that patients should use that really has all these resources with them. And they will give you those access to apps and good information on diets as well.
But knowing that something has gluten doesn't necessarily make it easy to eliminate it.
Correct. And so you got to change your whole cooking process as well, right? And so that's that way of thinking. And it's not just what's in it, but how you prepare it. And so there is, some tricks in the household. Get rid of all your nonstick. Nonstick holds on to oils. And this will make some people faint, but if you've got a good seasoned iron pan, that no longer can be something you cook a meal in with gluten, because the whole reason is that those oils kind of coat your pan, but now you really can't have that be safe for anyone who's gluten-free. So you not only have to throw out some pans and maybe buy some new ones. However, the cross-contamination of cooking is a little bit less of a concern, except for a couple factors. So we know just soapy water and running your pans under the dishwasher or even in the sink is a good enough way to reduce any risk of cross-contamination. Same thing with even cutting a cupcake with a stainless steel knife. You wipe that stainless steel knife off, you cut a cupcake with it's gluten-free, and there's almost no trace of gluten on that. So it doesn't have to be quite as extreme as I think some people that have, say, anaphylaxis to peanuts. We can't have peanuts on an airplane. You can sit next to someone with a cupcake and be okay.
But it is important to note that if one member of a family has problems with gluten, the entire family, to some extent, makes some adjustments.
Yeah, most of my families do. They become either a gluten-free or gluten light. I have not met a family that forces the other children to be gluten-free yet after this testing was done and they see that the serology. I mean, it is very important, I think, culturally to be able to have some of these foods.
Yeah.
And so, you can still live a life where people have different ingredients. One of those things is just keeping your wheat in a container that's, got a lid on it and you're not throwing around the kitchen and exposing all the air to it, which brings up another point that, at many restaurants, this can be difficult to navigate because the way they prepare the food might be gluten-free, but then if you've got a pizza crust that's gluten-free and you throw it on the same cooking surface as every other pizza crust that has wheat flour right on that surface, now you've kind of reached the point where that's not as safe to eat. Same thing with bakeries. Bakeries can have gluten-free items. Many are great. I will say there's a prominent bakery here in town whose son I diagnosed with celiac disease, and they overhauled their system where they cook gluten-free on one single day. They don't open up any of the other wheat flour containers, and they're very good about that. But you can't guarantee that with every restaurant or place outside the home.
Well, as I pointed out fairly insensitively at the first episode, I use gluten enhanced flours to bake pizza because I like the
Right.
chew. And so when I say that a family has to adjust, part of that is that, you're also trying not to make the person who's trying to be gluten free feel bad all the time for all the adjustments.
Right. And there are also other ways around it, right? You bring your extra cupcake for your toddler when they don't understand, or things like that. But ultimately, it is just education and owning it a little. And I tell my families, don't say you have a gluten allergy because that waiter might really not think that's a thing and, not pay attention. Explain to someone you have this celiac disease, it's autoimmune, I can't have this. And then get to know your restaurants because some restaurants are better than others. And again, that's a great part of our information systems today with apps and other things. By no means there's no disclosures I have here, but In-N-Out Burger is a great place to go because they really prepare their foods separately that need to be gluten-free. And the oils, they're not frying their chicken nuggets with gluten-containing batter in the same oils that they do their French fries. And so those are really important factors too.
Are there any particular cuisines that are more likely to be gluten free?
Non-American foods, I think this is the mainstay of our country, right? We have the wheat, what is it called? The basket. What's the Midwest called, Paul? You'll know this.
Breadbasket of America, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is what our soil supports. So we are not good at gluten-free cooking. However, most Asian kind of led foods, rice-based areas, those are actually a pretty good source of gluten-free cuisine. Because again, that's just their culture. They use rice in most of their cooking rather than wheat. So I do think non-American foods, Indian, Asian, those are places you can be a little more confident to go. Again, with some caveats, like the udon noodles might be put in the same oil to warm up and fry up that the wheat-based noodles are. So you still have to ask some questions. Sorry, the non-wheat based noodles. The other thing too, though, is that you can really only live a life probably 99% gluten-free, and that's okay. Once your body has healed from this, once your gut has recovered, you correct any micronutrient deficiencies you may have. It takes a lot. It takes a lot to bring it down. Again, different from an IgE or a mast cell process with an allergy. So a tiny bit here and there is not going to put your body back. It's not going to hopefully give you a increased risk for cancer later on. I mean, small amounts are okay. Not to say you should cheat. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you can't control every single thing you come in contact with.
And as you pointed out, if you're eating Chinese food, then do still remember that soy sauce can be an issue.
Correct. Yep. And tamari sauce is the key there. I mean, some people even prefer that, even that have gluten-containing diets.
Now, so in order to make foods gluten free, what sorts of adjustments are they making to the foods to in some ways simulate the effects of gluten?
Right. Well, this brings up an interesting topic that, again, goes back to gluten eliminating diets for health reasons, right? So people think, oh, gluten free must be healthy because celiac patients get better as soon as they take it out of their diet. Well, for someone who doesn't have disease, I would argue a gluten-free diet isn't necessarily better. One of the ways they make baked goods just as yummy as gluten-containing baked goods is they add a lot more sugar and a lot more of other ingredients to kind of give it that essence that gluten gives us. So that doesn't make it healthier in my mind, and you can eat gluten-free foods all day long, with as much butter and steak as you want. That doesn't make it exactly healthier. So there are some things that you can do to replicate kind of gluten-containing baked goods, but again, not necessarily healthier. So don't promote it that way. However, I do think that parents and families that have to go gluten-free, they pay attention, right? And exactly the other factor I said, they usually can't eat out quite as easily as they could in the old days. And so for that reason, I do think it adds a healthy aspect to the home just because you're paying attention.
One of the great challenges in making dietary changes are the economic and socioeconomic changes that you're often having to go to stores that make allowances for, or to restaurants that make allowances for being gluten-free. Any comment on that?
It is getting better, just like anything in the world of medicine. I'd rather live now than 100 years ago because of our technology with things. So there is a wider array at even the less, niche grocery stores, things that promote natural health foods. You can find these now in wide-based or more prominent grocery stores. There are also advocacy groups. I mean, the celiac.org that I plugged, there's a whole lobbying group that's really trying to help regulate prices of these so that they're not price gouging simply because they're gluten-free. Is it perfect yet? No. And I would say that we've had some pitfalls in Congress that people want deregulation more than regulation on certain things. And it's still not quite where it should be, but it's much better. So not only is the availability better, but the prices are getting better as well. To be fair, like I said, when you pay attention to what you eat and you buy more fresh fruits and vegetables, you can cook cheaply in any manner. But I wish there was a little bit better of set standards for pricing on this.
Once you've gone gluten-free, how do you monitor the response? Do you repeat a tissue transglutaminase?
Yes. So it's not over, the set it and forget it part actually isn't totally true. So we do advocate that all families with new diagnoses go through our dietitians, and there's dietitians all over the US. So it doesn't have to be one center versus another, but typically dietitians have a wealth of resources on how to cook, what to take out. And that's the learning curve of this. Gluten-free is not hard, but the learning curve is hard getting there. And so, like many processes with a chronic illness, you got to kind of adapt, and those adapting times in the first 6 months are difficult. And then after adapt, it becomes much easier. So I always say follow up with the dietitian first to learn about the disease. The second piece is more related to physician monitoring. Most patients don't have total micronutrient deficiencies at the time of diagnosis, but it does become a risk, and we should monitor them a little more closely. We place everyone on a multivitamin. Again, I will say Flintstone vitamins are not gluten-free, so you got to start reading labels for vitamins and supplements just as much as foods to find out if they use any wheat, and especially their chewable vitamins and the gummies. The gummies are another high risk. So we do put them on a multivitamin, and then we do about every 6 month check of certain blood work. So of course your TTG comes into this. Just like it's a good test to diagnose, it's a good response test because it will come down usually accordingly with how the body's response to getting all the antibodies of gluten out. That may still be elevated though 12 months after diagnosis without cheating, without any other exposure. And that's okay. We know that. We don't have exact numbers, when the studies have been done to say what is the time course it comes down, because it's a little different in, I think, ages, and probably body mass index plays into that. However, it should come down about after a year. And then we also look for vitamins, and the big ones actually are the ones that come up in the gluten-free products, right? So if you're eating a lot fewer baked goods, there's a caveat to that. What have we done? What have been the major advantages of science? We now fortify breads with things like B1, B2, a lot of our B vitamins to keep the public healthy, folate for good health in pregnant women and other people. So you do want to monitor once someone is gluten-free to make sure some of those micronutrients aren't completely deficient. And that can be about an every 6 months. And then last, you do want to look for things like thyroid disorders, because that's another concomitant to AI disease. And again, with AI disease, we don't feel like it's less likely if you control the celiac disease necessarily. I think that's what people think, like, oh, I'm controlling this, therefore I have a lower risk. Some of that might be true, but it's still going to be a risk. And especially for kids, if they're not hitting growth markers, if they're not hitting puberty right away, you want to look for other things besides just celiac disease.
Remembering that there's for instance, an association with Turner's and
Correct. Yep.
does anyone need a repeat biopsy?
Controversial part of this episode. So, yes, hardly ever though. I think I have done one repeat biopsy in 10 years of this because, like I mentioned, the blood work really does give a window into the gut soul. If the TTG is coming down, you can be reassured that their gut is most likely healing, and you check in on symptoms and that sort of thing. There is a subset of patients that may say they have more symptoms still, or the symptoms are still a little wacky, whether that's bloating or other things. But then it doesn't necessarily mean you need biopsies. Sometimes a little bit of digging into their dietary journal or something like that will expose reasons they might have irritable bowel symptoms. One of those would be lactose. So when I mentioned in the first episode, the reason all this gut damage happens is because the tops of our villi are knocked down and have inflammation. Well, that's where it lives to break down your lactose. So anyone that has lactose deficiency, that enzyme comes out right at the tips of our villi. So people with celiac disease are often at the time of diagnosis also lactose sensitive. Again, I won't say allergy, it's nothing like that. It just means they don't have enough lactase enzyme to break down the sugar product of milk products. Some people will have that grow back. So in 2 to 3 months, when you have the turnover of cells in your gut and your villi grow back, you can tolerate a little more lactose again. Some people never get it back. So those are other things that I think a general pediatrician or other doctors kind of treating this should just be aware of, that you might have to be either transient lactose free or lactose low, but it's worth maybe trying again in a couple months.
If somebody has an established diagnosis, gluten challenge seems like a bad idea.
I don't see any role in that, right? Once we know it's an autoimmune disorder, that's it for you. And I would say don't even call it a gluten challenge. I think a wheat challenge, if someone doesn't have celiac, sounds appropriate, but it's not always the gluten. Stop blaming gluten all the time. Hurt its feelings.
Quick metaphysical question. You said the soul of the gut. So does the gut have a separate soul from the rest of the body?
Oh man, I think the guts control everything in our existence. They're leading us around in life, right?
They are. They are. I've been warned not to ask whether the microbiome then is in charge of us. Any other markers we should be thinking about? Is IL-2 helpful?
Well, as we mentioned last episode, the poop markers aren't there yet. So don't go chasing after some glorified internet site that doesn't have any contact info of a lab for a poop test. But there have been some studies that show that maybe we have other clues about inflammation going on with celiac disease. One of those is IL-2. They were testing a promising drug, and we'll get to that maybe in a minute, that could sort of disguise gluten so that your body actually didn't react to it. And when they had people do a true gluten challenge, and again, this is a test, not just a layperson's hypothesis, but when they fed people a noticeable part of gluten, their IL-2 sparked, and that's the cytokine that we have, in relation to other things too, inflammatory bowel disease, you'll see IL-2 markers go up. However, if you're having someone that their TTG has recovered, they can't find gluten in their diet, this might be a promising biomarker we can use in the future. Not there yet completely, but it's really cool to know that we're looking at other things in our bodies that react to gluten.
Let's talk about some of these alternative treatments. And what about enzyme therapies? I recognize this is not like lactose intolerance, but that may alter the way we approach gluten.
Correct. So I give a visualization of this to my patients because they always want to know, can't there just be a med like the lactase replacement therapy that we all know and love well if you're lactose intolerant, and that take away, all the gluten burden? But sugars are easy to do that with. They are easy compounds. You can cleave, this going back to our biochem and organic chemistry days, you can cleave those bonds pretty easily from a sugar perspective. Gluten is a complex protein, and those just create such a harder way of breaking down in our bodies. Pretty amazing, actually, that we can do this with so many different types of foods, proteins. But I always liken it to a mesh ball. How do you unravel a mesh ball versus kind of a string of sugars? And so with that, the technology just really isn't there. So that's why, some of the research that's been done lately, as I mentioned, they called it a vaccine. It really wasn't a vaccine. It was a injection of a peptide. And what it was trying to do is attach to the protein enough to make it unrecognizable to our bodies. And similar to allergy shots, this was probably a treatment that you were going to have to get on a regular basis. It's not like one and done. You can't create a memory cell to this protein. However, that drug stopped in phase 2 trials because it really just wasn't effective. So that's where the frustration in research comes from, is that it's just a hard thing to unravel, to be able to take your gluten proteins and find a way to make it unrecognizable to the body.
What about immune modulating drugs? I watch a lot of TV. There's got to be a mAb for that.
Yeah, you're right. So all our inflammatory bowel and our inflammatory disease, our rheumatologic disease, they have these beautiful meds now that really stop our inflammatory cascades and put patients with inflammatory conditions into remission. So we are very grateful for those meds. As someone who treats inflammatory bowel disease patients, I bow down every day that we have this technology outside of steroids. So celiac disease is a inflammatory causing disease, right? We have what we call lymphocytes, and those are the white blood cells that end up infiltrating our guts. And any steroid is going to be able to knock those down. So could you cure celiac disease with steroids? Sure. But do you want those side effects from steroids? No. Same kind of idea for these anti-inflammatory meds, the monoclonal antibodies. I'm sure we could get to a point where they are effective on celiac disease, but there's no way with the side effect profiles of reducing our immune system and other things that are a little more dangerous that come with that. I mean, we have a curative thing with celiac disease, which is you take out gluten, and that's possible for us to live a healthy life by just removing that one dietary factor. So I just don't think there's any way we would use a med when clearly, as going back to Hippocrates' days, food is thy medicine, right? And we've figured that out with this disease.
So if we can't change the human, what about changing the gluten? Can you change the genetics of wheat and rye? And
Well, you can, right? As I said, we're the breadbasket of the US, and we've now had sort of genetic alterations and modified foods, which depends on what side of the line you're on, can be a good or bad thing. But that actually has come out recently that I think is super promising and really encouraging, where these researchers out of UC Davis, they were given grants, NIH grants from the Celiac Foundation, and they are now trying to genetically alter the wheat. So, right, so we can't alter the human, but can we alter the wheat? And there's been some really good promise. Not the easiest thing. There's still a quote from that paper said there are more than 50 proteins with these epitopes on the wheat protein concentrated in 9 regions of the wheat chromosome. And so it's still kind of hard to totally alter the wheat over and over again, right? Because diversity, as we know from Jurassic Park, DNA and genetics will find a way. And so just like every other plant, there probably is a lot to make one gluten safe plant over and over. But hey, we've got biospheres coming and all that sort of thing. So maybe we'll have that done.
I mean, this is the land of amber waves of grain, so we're
Yeah.
trying to figure it out.
And that's actually, to put another perspective too, that has been another hypothesis in the uptick of incidence of celiac disease, that we have made our wheat too generic or too similar between, only having about 3 major companies that supply the large amounts of wheat to grow the US. And so there is a big push to diversify your wheat, go to local farmers. I have had some families claim that they go to Italy and they don't have a problem with their pasta there, but then they come here and they can't handle American grown wheat pasta. So I don't have any evidence for this, but I do think it is thoughtful to say, maybe we do need to back up and homogenize, there we go, dehomogenize our food supply. And perhaps that would take our incidence down a little in future generations.
It's probably good agriculture in lots of ways, but what do I know?
Yeah,
Well,
eat locally, right? Eat closer to home and
yeah,
and try your best at supporting a smaller batch farmer.
yeah. Anything else you want to say about the treatment of celiac disease?
Like I said, it does seem pretty easy. It is one thing to take out. Just ensure that the family gets follow-up and has good education resources, because it's not as easy as possible. You can also, again, this is the overlap between subspecialty and primary care. I send them back to my primary care providers after their vitamins have come back normal ranges. I sort of give the list of yearly labs like the thyroid hormone and some of the other things like vitamin D and folate to check. And then I hand that to the parents. I say, you have a great pediatrician. Keep up with your well child checks and do this once a year through them. And I haven't found any pediatricians come after me with a pitchfork. I mean, I think they do want to be involved in these patients' chronic cares. And it's a really good way to sort of merge both not just a diagnosis, but then a lifelong treatment
Right,
plan with
right.
patients.
As it should be, right? That you have the advantage of subspecialty knowledge, and we have the advantage of longitudinal relationship and relationship generally. And so I think the magic happens when we collaborate.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you, Anna Ermarth. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your expertise. Thanks for spending some time with us. Is there anything you want to share about the microbiome before we finish?
Oh man. Again, the black hole of medicine, I say.
Yeah, right.
Parents come in, they want to know what probiotic, what prebiotic to add. And I find it exciting. Every time there's a microbiome study, I look at it and say, what's interesting? I think there are some key factors as a gastroenterologist. So we've shown that dogs reduce allergies in a household. I don't think we've shown that with celiac disease. But as someone who's lived with both dogs and cats, it's not the same for cats, right? Cats don't reduce, they don't change a microbiome, but they have shown studies that dogs will change that. Of course, I've had some dogs that go out, eat their own poop, and come in and lick your floor, so you know where that's coming from.
Yes, they do, which is recycling at its finest. Thanks for spending time with us this month. We'll look forward to dealing with some questions next week. Please send your questions to questions.
Just none on the dog microbiome. I'm not an expert in that.
But feel free to ask, and we'll plumb the depths of the black hole of gastroenterology with Dr. Anna Ermarth. Thanks, Elisa Stoddard, for making this sound like a podcast, and thanks, Janice, for listening. Please tell your friends and neighbors and people you don't like very much, tell them to all listen. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Production design and editing thanks to Paul Wirkus, who also composed the theme music. See you next time.